This is Halleck Hoffman speaking from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. The center was established by the Fund for the Republic to clarify basic questions of freedom and justice, especially those raised by the emerging power of 20th century institutions. The center is currently examining such subjects as the economic order, the political process, science and technology, communications, law, labor, education, the American character, war, and peace. The talk you are about to hear was presented during a two-day convocation held in New York to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Fund for the Republic. The subject of the convocation was the challenges to democracy in the next decade. In the following talk, Louis Mumford discusses technology and democratic institutions. Mr. Mumford, president of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, has written extensively on the history of technology. Mr. Mumford's talk will be followed by comments from Admiral Hyman G. Rickover of the Atomic Energy Commission. Now, Mr. Mumford.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the accident of being the first speaker at this conference puts me under the necessity of redefining, very tentatively of course, the central concept of democracy, a term now confused and sophisticated by indiscriminate use and often treated with patronizing contempt. Can we agree, no matter how far we might diverge at a later point, that the spinal principle of democracy is to place what is common to all men above that which any institution, organization, or group may claim for itself? This is not to deny the claims of superior natural endowment, specialized knowledge, technical skill, or institutional organization. All these may, by democratic permission, play a useful role in the human economy. But democracy consists in giving final authority to the whole rather than the part. And only living human beings, as such, are an authentic expression of the whole, whether acting alone or with the help of others. Around this central principle clusters a group of related ideas and practices with a long foreground in history, although they are not always present or present in equal amounts in all societies. Among these items are communal self-government, free communication as between equals, unimpeded access to the common store of knowledge, protection against arbitrary external controls, and a sense of individual moral responsibility for behavior that affects the whole community. All living organisms are in some degree autonomous in that they follow a life pattern of their own, but in man this autonomy is an essential condition for his further development. We surrender some of our autonomy when we're ill or crippled, but to surrender it every day would be to turn life itself into a chronic illness. The best life possible, and here I am consciously treading on contested ground, is one that calls for an ever greater degree of self-realization, self-direction, self-expression. In this sense, personality, once the exclusive attribute of kings, belongs on democratic theory to every man. Life itself, in its fullness and richness, cannot be delegated. In framing this provisional definition, I trust that I have not, for the sake of agreement, left out anything important. Democracy, in the primal sense I shall use the term, is necessarily most visible in relatively small communities and groups whose members meet frequently, face to face, interact freely, and are known to each other as persons. As soon as large numbers are involved, democratic association must be supplemented by a more abstract, depersonalized form. Historic experience shows that it is much easier to wipe out democracy by an institutional arrangement that gives authority only to those at the apex of the social hierarchy than it is to incorporate democratic practices into a well-organized system under centralized direction. which achieves the highest degree of mechanical efficiency when those who work for it have no mind or purpose of their own. Now, the tension between small-scale association and large-scale organization, between personal autonomy and institutional regulation, between remote control and diffused local intervention, has now created the critical situation that has brought us together for discussion, let us hope democratic discussion, today. If our eyes had been opened, we might have long ago have discovered this conflict was deeply embedded in technology itself. I wish it were possible to characterize Technics with as much hope of getting assent, with whatever quizzical reserves you may still have, as in this description of democracy. But the very title of this paper is, I confess, a controversial one. And I cannot go far in my analysis without drawing on interpretations that have not yet been adequately published, still less widely discussed or rigorously criticized and evaluated. My thesis, to put it bluntly, is that from late Neolithic times in the Near East right down to our own day, two technologies have recurrently existed side by side, one authoritarian, the other democratic. The first, system-centered, immensely powerful, but inherently unstable. The other, man-centered, relatively weak, but resourceful and durable. If I am right, we are now approaching a point at which, unless we radically alter our present course, our surviving democratic techniques will be completely suppressed or supplanted, so that every residual autonomy will be wiped out, or will be permitted only as a playful device of government, like national balloting for already chosen leaders in totalitarian countries. The data on which this thesis is based are familiar to most of you, but their significance has, I believe, been overlooked. What I would call democratic techniques is the small-scale method of production resting mainly on human skill and animal energy, but always, even when employing machines and extra animal power, remains under the active direction of the craftsman or the farmer, each group developing its own gifts through appropriate arts and social ceremonies, as well as making discreet use of the gifts of nature. This technology had limited horizons of achievement, but just because of its wide diffusion and its modest demands, it had great powers of adaptation and recuperation. Till now, this democratic tactics has underpinned and firmly supported every historic culture and redeemed the constant tendency of authoritarian techniques to misapply its powers. Even when paying tribute to the most oppressive totalitarian regime, there yet remained within the workshop or the farmyard some degree of autonomy, selectivity, creativity. No royal mace, no slave driver's whip, no bureaucratic directive left its imprint on the textiles of Damascus or the pottery of 5th century Athens. If this democratic techniques goes back to the earliest use of tools, authoritarian techniques is a much more recent achievement. It begins around the 4th millennium BC in a new configuration of mechanical invention, scientific observation, and centralized political control that gave rise to the peculiar mode of life we may now identify, without eulogy, as civilization. Under the new institution of kingship, activities that had been scattered, diversified, cut to the human measure, were united on a monumental scale into an entirely new kind of theological, technological mass organization. In the person of an absolute ruler whose word was law, cosmic powers came down to earth, mobilizing and unifying the efforts of thousands of men, hitherto all too autonomous and decentralized, to act voluntarily in unison for purposes that lay beyond the village horizon. The new authoritarian technology was not limited by village custom or human sentiment. Its Herculean feats of mechanical organization rested on ruthless physical coercion, forced labor, and slavery, which brought into existence machines that were capable of exerting thousands of horsepower, centuries before horses were even harnessed or wheels invented. This centralized technics drew on inventions and scientific discoveries of a high order: the written record, mathematics and astronomy, irrigation and canalization. Above all, it created complex human machines composed of specialized, standardized, replaceable, interdependent parts: the work army, the military army, the bureaucracy. These work armies and military armies raised the ceiling of human achievement, the first in mass construction, the second in mass destruction, both on a scale hitherto inconceivable. Despite its constant drive to destruction, this totalitarian techniques was tolerated, perhaps even welcomed, for it created, at least in its home territory, for it created the first economy of controlled abundance. Notably, immense food crops that not merely supported a big urban population, but released a large trained minority for purely religious, scientific, bureaucratic, or military activity. But the efficiency of the system was impaired by weaknesses that were never overcome until our own day. To begin with, the democratic economy of the agricultural village resisted incorporation into the new authoritarian system. So even the Roman Empire found it expedient, once resistance was broken and taxes were collected, to consent to a large degree of local autonomy in religion and government. Moreover, as long as agriculture absorbed the labor of some 90% of the population, mass techniques were confined largely to the populous urban centers. Since authoritarian technology first took form in an age when metals were scarce and human material captured in war was easily convertible into machines, its directors never bothered to invent inorganic mechanical substitutes. But there were even greater weaknesses. The system had no inner coherence, a break in communication, a missing link in the chain of command, and the great human machines fell apart. Finally, the myths upon which this whole system was based, particularly the essential myth of kingship, were irrational, with their paranoid suspicions and animosities and their paranoid claims to unconditional obedience and absolute power. For all its redoubtable constructive achievements, authoritarian techniques expressed a deep hostility to life. By now you doubtless see the point of this brief historic excursus. That authoritarian techniques has come back today in an immensely magnified and adroitly perfected form. Up to now, following the optimistic premises of 19th century thinkers like Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer, we have regarded the spread of experimental science and mechanical invention as the soundest guarantee of a peaceful, productive, above all, democratic society. Many have even comfortably supposed that the revolt against arbitrary political power in the 17th century was causally connected with the Industrial Revolution that accompanied it. But what we have interpreted as the new freedom now turns out to be a much more sophisticated version of the old slavery. For the rise of political democracy during the last few centuries has been increasingly nullified by the successful resurrection of a centralized authoritarian technics, a techniques that had in fact for long lapsed in many parts of the world. Let us fool ourselves no longer. At the very moment Western nations threw off the ancient regime of absolute government, operating under a once divine king, they were restoring this same system in a far more effective form in their technology, reintroducing coercions of a military character, no less strict in the organization of a factory than in that of the new drilled, uniformed, and regimented army. During the transitional stages of the last 2 centuries, the ultimate tendency of this system might be in doubt. For in many areas there were strong democratic reactions. But with the knitting together of a scientific technology itself liberated from theological restrictions or humanistic purposes, authoritarian techniques found an instrument at hand that has now given it absolute command of physical energies of cosmic dimensions. The inventors of nuclear bombs, space rockets, and computers are the pyramid builders of our own age, psychologically inflated by a similar myth of unqualified power, boasting through their science of their increasing omnipotence, if not omniscience, moved by obsessions and compulsions no less irrational than those of earlier absolute systems, particularly the notion that the system itself must be expanded at whatever eventual cost to life. Through mechanization, automation, cybernetic direction, this authoritarian techniques has at last successfully overcome its most serious weakness, its original dependence upon resistant, sometimes actively disobedient servo mechanisms, still human enough to harbor purposes that do not always coincide with those of the system. Now, like the earliest form of authoritarian techniques, this new technology is marvelously dynamic and productive. Its power in every form tends to increase without limits in quantities that defy assimilation and control, whether we are thinking of the output of scientific knowledge or of industrial assembly lines. To maximize energy, speed, or automation, without reference to the complex conditions that sustain organic life, have become ends in themselves. As with the earliest forms of authoritarian techniques, the weight of effort, if one is to judge by national budgets, is toward absolute instruments of destruction, designed for irrational purposes, whose chief byproduct would be the mutilation or extermination of the human race. Even Ashurbanipal and Genghis Khan performed their gory operations under more normal human limits. But observe, the center of authority in this new system is no longer a visible personality, an all-powerful king. Even in totalitarian dictatorships, the center now lies in the system itself, invisible but omnipresent. All its human components, even the technical and managerial elite, even the sacred priesthood of science, who alone have access to the secret knowledge by means of which total control is now being swiftly effected, are themselves all trapped by the very perfection of the organization they have invented. Like the pharaohs of the pyramid age, these servants of the system identify their goods with their own kind of well-being. As with the divine king, their praise of the system is an act of self-worship. And again, like the king, they are in the grip of an irrational compulsion to extend their means of control and expand the scope of their authority. In this new systems-centered collective, this pentagon of power, there is no visible presence who issues commands. Unlike Job's God, the new deities cannot be confronted, still less defied. Under the pretext of saving labor, the ultimate end of this technics is to displace life, or rather to transfer the attributes of life to the machine and the mechanical collective, allowing only so much of the organism to remain as may be controlled and manipulated. Do not misunderstand this analysis. The danger to democracy does not spring from any specific scientific discoveries or electronic inventions. The human compulsions that dominate the authoritarian techniques of our day date back to a period before even the wheel had been invented. The danger springs from the fact that since Francis Bacon and Galileo defined the new methods and objectives of technics, our great physical transformations have been affected by a system that deliberately eliminates the whole human personality, ignores the historic process, overplays the role of the abstract intelligence, and makes control over physical nature, ultimately control over man himself, the chief purpose of existence. This system has made its way so insidiously into Western society that my analysis of its derivation and its intentions may well seem more questionable, indeed more shocking, than the terrible facts themselves. But why has our age surrendered so easily to the controllers, the manipulators, the conditioners of an authoritarian techniques? The answer to this question is both paradoxical and ironic. Present-day techniques differs from that of the overtly brutal, half-baked authoritarian systems of the past in one highly favorable particular. It has accepted the basic principle of democracy, that every member of society should have a share in its goods. By progressively fulfilling this part of the democratic promise, our system has achieved a hold over the whole community that threatens to wipe out every other vestige of democracy. The bargain we are being asked to ratify takes the form of a magnificent bribe. Under the democratic, authoritarian social contract, each member of the community may claim every material advantage, every intellectual and emotional stimulus he may desire, in quantities hardly available hitherto, even for a restricted minority. Food, housing, swift transportation, instantaneous communication, medical care, entertainment, education. But on one condition: that one must not merely ask for nothing that the system does not provide, but likewise agree to take everything offered, duly processed and fabricated, homogenized and equalized, in the precise quantities that the system, rather than the person, requires. Once one opts for the system, no further choice remains. In a word, if one surrenders one's life at source, authoritarian techniques will give back as much of it as can be mechanically graded, quantitatively multiplied, collectively manipulated and magnified. Is this not a fair bargain? Those who speak for the system will ask. Are not the goods authoritarian techniques promises real goods? Is this not the veritable horn of plenty that mankind has long dreamed of, and that every ruling class has tried to secure, at whatever cost of brutality and injustice, for itself? I would not belittle, much less deny, the many admirable products this technology has brought forth, products that a self-regulating economy would make good use of. I would only suggest that it is time to reckon up the human disadvantages and costs, to say nothing of the dangers of our unqualified acceptance of the system itself. Even the immediate price is heavy, for the system is so far from being under effective human direction that it may poison us wholesale in order to provide us with food, or exterminate us to provide national security before we can enjoy its promised goods. And is it really humanly profitable to give up the possibility of living a few years at Walden Pond, so to say, for the privilege of spending a lifetime in Skinner's Walden Tomb? Once our authoritarian techniques consolidates its powers with the aid of its new forms of mass control, its panoply of tranquilizers and sedatives and aphrodisiacs, could democracy in any form survive? That question is absurd. Life itself will not survive, except what is funneled through the mechanical collective. The spread of a sterilized scientific intelligence over the planet would not, as Teilhard de Chardin so innocently imagined, be the happy consummation of divine purpose. It would rather ensure the final arrest of any further human development. Again, do not mistake my meaning. This is not a prediction of what will happen, but a warning against what may happen. We are gathered here now, I take it, to see what means must be taken to escape this fate. In characterizing the authoritarian techniques that has begun to dominate us, I have not forgotten the great lesson of history. Prepare for the unexpected. Nor do I overlook the immense reserves of vitality and creativity that a more humane, democratic tradition still offers us. What I wish to do is to persuade those who are concerned with maintaining democratic institutions to see that their constructive efforts must include technology itself. There, too, we must return to the human center. We must challenge this authoritarian system that has given to an underdimensioned ideology and technology the authority that belongs alone to the human personality. I repeat, life cannot be delegated. Curiously, the first words in support of this thesis came forth with exquisite symbolic aptness from a willing agent, but very nearly a classic victim of the new authoritarian techniques. They came from the astronaut John Glenn, whose life was endangered by the malfunctioning of his automatic controls, operated arbitrarily from a remote center. after he had barely saved his life by personal intervention, he emerged from his space capsule with these ringing words: "Now let man take over." That command is easier to utter than to obey. But if we are not to be driven to even more drastic measures than Samuel Butler suggested in Erewhon, we had better map out a more positive course, namely the reconstitution of both our science and our technics in such a fashion as to insert the rejected parts of the human personality at every stage of the process. This means gladly sacrificing mere quantity in order to restore qualitative choice, shifting the seat of authority from the mechanical collective to the human personality and the autonomous group, favoring variety and ecological complexity instead of stressing undue uniformity and mass standardization. Above all, reducing the insensate drive to extend the system itself instead of containing it within definite human limits and thus releasing man himself for other and higher purposes. We must ask not what is good for science, good for technology, still less what is good for General Motors or Union Carbide or IBM or even the Pentagon, but what is good for man. Not machine-conditioned, system-regulated mass man, but man in person, moving freely over every area of life. There are large areas of technology that can be redeemed by the democratic process, once we have overcome the infantile compulsions and automatisms that now threaten to cancel out our real gains. The very leisure that the machine now gives in advanced countries can be profitably used, not for further commitment to still other kinds of machine, furnishing automatic recreation or automatic thought, but by doing significant forms of work, unprofitable or technically impossible under mass production, work dependent upon special skill, knowledge, aesthetic sense. The do-it-yourself movement prematurely got bogged down in an attempt to sell still more machines. But its slogan pointed in the right direction, provided we still have a self to do it with. The glut of motor cars that is now destroying our cities can be coped with only if we redesign our cities to make fuller use of a more efficient human agent, the walker. Even in childbirth, the emphasis is already happily shifting from an officious, often lethal authoritarian procedure centered in the physician and in hospital routine to a more human mode which restores initiative to the mother and to the body's natural rhythms. The rebuilding of a democratic technics is plainly too big a subject to be handled in a final sentence or two. But I trust I have made it clear that the genuine advantages of our scientifically based techniques can be preserved only if we cut the whole system back to a point at which it will permit human alternatives, human interventions, and human destinations for entirely different purposes from those of the system itself. At the present juncture, if democracy did not exist, we would have to invent it in order to restore and fortify and replenish the spirit of man.
That was Lewis Mumford speaking on authoritarian and democratic techniques at the recent convocation of the Fund for the Republic. Now Admiral Hyman G. Rickover of the Atomic Energy Commission comments.
Mr. Mumford offers a fruitful avenue of approach to the topic under discussion by emphasizing the human values democracy seems to protect and nourish, and by showing how gravely these are threatened in authoritarian technologies. He establishes the primacy of democratic institutions over technology. We must clearly distinguish two basic facts about technology. First, that while it enables us to increase our power of mind and body, it does not dictate how we use this power. In this sense, technology is neutral. We remain a controller of our actions, and we are responsible for their consequences. I am unconvinced when people tell me that rapid scientific progress, which changes fundamentally the ways we provide for our material wants, thereby obsolete the fundamental ethical and moral principles that Western man has painfully evolved over the centuries. Why ever should machine-produced affluence invalidate the Ten Commandments or the Sermon on the Mount? What has improved health to do with that great Western concept of the supreme moral worth of the individual, which flows from belief in the fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man, the concept that is the foundation of our own and every other democracy in the world? As machines relieve us of the brutal, tiring, and time-consuming labor that has been the lot of the majority of men from time immemorial, as they enable us to universalize affluence and leisure, we face a choice. We may take these benefits and live the life of the idle rich of old, pursuing a good time and not bothering about the quality of our own life or the life of the nation. Or we may decide to emulate these, and there were many who in the past considered wealth and leisure a trust to be utilized for self-improvement and for improvement of their particular societies. The choice is for each individual to make. Moreover, each individual under our form of government has a right to speak out publicly in favor of making better use of science and technology than is possible under present conditions. If those who agree with this new viewpoint become a majority, in other words, if a consensus is reached through public discussion of this issue, the American people may decide to take action. The action may displease a powerful vested interest, but this is how we govern ourselves. The status quo has no absolute sanctity under our form of government. It must constantly justify itself to the people in whom is vested ultimate sovereignty over the nation. We have gotten into the deplorable habit of regarding all who think and speak about ways to improve our way of life as persons hostile to American democracy or lacking in love of country, or at least as being disagreeable, controversial curmudgeons. Let us ponder the following words taken from the Declaration of Independence. It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish their government and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. New ideas always originate in the individual mind. If they are good ideas, they will make their way and eventually be realized. It is well to remember that the American political system, of which we are so justly proud, began in just this way. The revolt against England did not begin because the colonists wanted a new and different kind of government. Quite the contrary. They struggled to assert their rights of Englishmen, notably representation in Parliament and the benefits of the Bill of Rights, which had been wrested from William and Mary in 1688. England failed to muster the political sagacity to grant these rights while there were still time to hold colonial demands to this modest claim. It seems clear that until quite late in the struggle, the majority of the colonists would have been satisfied had they been granted equal rights with Englishmen. Even toward the end of the war, the majority did not look beyond the goal of political independence. Along the Atlantic seaboard, the settlers had created a faithful replica of England, though shorn of the top layer of the aristocracy and happily from the bottom layer. Only where the settled regions ended and the wilderness began had a new type of society, a new type of man, a new way of life begun to take shape. It was the immense achievement of the Founding Fathers to recognize that this was something unique, something not existing in England or anywhere else in the world, and that this new society and this new kind of man could realize what the Age of Reason had only envisaged as a kind of utopia, that is, a truly free society in which men govern themselves. The Founding Fathers were steeped in the classics and were themselves part of the school of thought that dominated 18th century political philosophy in the Western world. Our country is a child of rationalism. It came into being pursuant to a contract, the Constitution, which was submitted to and accepted by the American people. Ours was the first such government, although there was something akin to it in a document signed August 1st, 1291, from which the Swiss date the beginning of their democratic state. Like the Swiss, we began with a tabula rasa. Like the Swiss, our overriding concern was with freedom. It seems to me of utmost importance that we observe the order of precedence in the Declaration of Independence, for it shows more clearly than even the Constitution what the Founding Fathers conceived democracy to be. The Declaration declares first that all men are born with inalienable rights and lists some of these rights. It then proceeds to state that it is to secure these rights that governments are instituted among men. And finally, it states flatly that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. We now hold it to be a self-evident truth that liberty is an indispensable attribute of the individual. Not absolute liberty, of course, for this is not possible unless man lives on an uninhabited isle, but the broadest liberty compatible with life in society. This idea, to which we now all subscribe, came out of the minds of but a few great men. We have never since had political philosophers who could measure up to the Founding Fathers. Their concept of democracy is our precious heritage. I presume, then, that we all here accept the proposition that technology makes sense only when it produces human happiness in a free society. For Americans, at least, the two go together. Were we to prefer an affluent and carefree life for the freedom and responsibilities possessed by democratic citizens, we should be sacrificing our heritage for a mess of pottage, an inexcusable folly, no matter how good the pottage might be. Perhaps we might, for greater clarity, restate our topic to read, how can we find ways to obtain the benefits of technology without destroying or weakening our democratic institutions? So much for the first basic fact of technology. It does not dictate how we use the increased power it gives our minds and bodies. Now to the second fact. In using science, which is what technology means, we must heed what I like to call the categorical imperatives of science. We must respect nature over which science gives us control, for if we don't, nature will strike back. I can best illustrate this with an example. Today, we are able to destroy insect pests and weeds with new chemicals that science has developed. The use of these scientific inventions is profitable for those who manufacture the chemicals. It is helpful to farmers who are able to get better crops, reduce human labor, and thus produce at greater profit. It benefits consumers who are offered a wider variety of food at less cost. Here is a classic case of what technology can do for us. Unfortunately, we have left out of consideration the balance of nature. If used improperly, these pesticides and weed killers may poison soil, crops, animals, and eventually man. Rachel Carson warns us eloquently against committing this ecological sin in her book, Silent Spring. In my own field of work, I am constantly aware of the harm that nuclear reactors improperly designed or operated could do. Radiation is one of the hazards that must be constantly kept in mind. The same is true to a much larger extent of nuclear bombs. We are here getting involved in extremely tricky manipulation of powerful natural forces. Because the general public does not fully understand the categorical imperatives of science, it cannot itself exert control in this field. Recently, the United States Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. ruled against the city of New Britain, Connecticut, which tried to prevent a private firm from receiving and storing radioactive wastes in the city for disposal elsewhere. The court rejected the case of the people of New Britain on the grounds that the handling of radioactive waste there does not involve any credible possibility of contamination of the ground, air, or soil. Now, I wish it clearly understood that I do not question the accuracy of this statement by the court. I wish merely to bring out that in making the statement, the court of necessity did not base its decision on its own ascertainment of the facts, but said in effect, the Atomic Energy Commission knows the facts, and it knows that they will not harm the city. What else could the court have done? It must rely on expert opinion. The Congress has set up the Atomic Energy Commission to provide the American people with expert opinion, and the Commission does this expertly and most conscientiously. It relies on the best scientific and engineering advice it can obtain. But in a subtle way, democracy is undermined when an important aspect of the life of individuals and communities can no longer be judged by the voter, but must be entrusted to experts who work in areas of science that the general public does not comprehend. As presently constituted, our democratic institutions, to which the will of the people normally expresses itself, and which under our Constitution are required to heed that will, these institutions are themselves not well equipped to control the proper use of technology. In nuclear power, I feel we have developed the best attainable safeguards. In other technologies, we have been less successful. I suggest we explore as a second aspect of our topic the question, how can democratic institutions best control the use of technology so that neither the individual nor the nation will be harmed? Mr. Mumford warns that sheer size, the superhuman scale of many of our organizations damages human values that are part of our democratic way of life. They dwarf man, they diminish his autonomy and thus his ability to function effectively as a citizen exercising the power of self-government. They become bureaucracies where masses of people work under direction and little room is left for individual initiative. It seems that large-scale enterprise tends irresistibly to bureaucracy, whether it be private or public. Bigness thus enters our topic of discussion. And not all of the bigness is a direct consequence of the use or misuse of technology. We are an enormously populous nation. Even if times were normal, we should need big government to keep us from harming one another. We are only beginning to realize that for generations we have had a population explosion the like of which the world has never seen. From 1800 to 1850, we quintupled. From 1850 to 1900, we trebled. From 1900 to 1950, we doubled the numbers, and we are likely to double again by 2000. If we keep on at our present rate of population growth, the doubling time being about 40 years, there are children alive today in this country who will see the population of this country reach 1 billion. When we celebrate the bicentennial of the adoption of the Constitution, will be so numerous that each of us will be left with no more than about 1% of the voting power possessed by Americans in our first national election. This cannot but diminish the citizen's sense of importance and lead to political apathy, itself the greatest threat to democracy. Technology has had little to do with this growth. Other industrial nations long ago cut down from half to 1/3 our growth rate. They recognize their limitations of space. We have trouble realizing that we ceased long ago to be a land where people were scarce. I noticed recently in the weekly press that the greater use of poisonous weed killers in this country compared to Europe was justified by a high official on the grounds that abroad labor was abundant while here it was scarce. The opposite is, of course, true. But this change has crept up on us and we haven't noticed it. When this was an underpopulated country, every man's worth was automatically enhanced because he was sorely needed. But now we have endemic unemployment, which I, for one, believe cannot be overcome merely by producing more and more consumer goods. It is hard to predict what effects chronic unemployment may have on a sense of independence that has always been so vital a part of the American character. The Founding Fathers considered abundant free land as one of the pillars of the democratic state they were creating. Jefferson thought that for many generations to come there would be land for the taking. He was convinced that life in crowded Europe made the rootless, propertyless people unfit to discharge the responsibilities of citizenship, but that American farmers, tradesmen, and merchants owning their small businesses could manage a democracy because they had daily practice in making independent decisions and weighing the consequences of their actions. Well, 9 out of 10 Americans now work for others, many for giant organizations. Galbraith, I believe, once pointed out that the average American family, heavily indebted by installment buying, is but 3 weeks removed from bankruptcy. Moreover, 70% of us now live in the crowded urban conglomerations we call megalopolis. In his mistrust of what he called the canal of European cities, Jefferson, for once, was wrong. Some of the most civilized democracies have evolved in countries that had such cities in Jefferson's time. We ourselves have managed the democratic process remarkably well, though we are now bereft of every single special advantage the Founding Fathers considered essential to the success of a democracy. Few people, much land, independent small-scale enterprise, and finally the greatest of all advantages, geographic isolation, which allowed us to go about our peaceful pursuits without fear of foreign invasion. De Tocqueville noted that America had no neighbors. Few of us realize what an immense advantage that was in working out our destiny on this huge and rich continent. Half a century ago, Woodrow Wilson remarked, somewhat wistfully it seems to me, that the stage of America grows crowded like the stage of Europe. The life of the New World grows as complex as the life of the Old. We still have important advantages. We still have much more land per capita, greater natural wealth, though it is rapidly being used up. We still have a strong tradition of individual initiative. Nevertheless, we are neither the only nor in every respect the most successful democracy, politically speaking. There are things we can learn from abroad, notably the way standards in such fields as general education, training of skilled workers and technicians, and licensing of professional people are set nationally and enforced locally. Usually such standards are established by calling on the country's best minds to cooperate with central and local authorities. Once set, most of the responsibility for putting the standards into effect falls to the local authorities. It is true that parliamentary democracy facilitates this, but if we give this problem careful thought and debate it widely, I am sure we could devise our own procedures.
You have been listening to Louis Mumford, noted author, critic, and president of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, speaking on authoritarian and democratic techniques. Mr. Mumford's talk was followed by comments from Admiral Hyman G. Rickover of the Atomic Energy Commission. The discussion took place in January 1963, before the 10th anniversary convocation of the Fund for the Republic. This is Halleck Hoffman speaking from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara.